My name is Lauren. I'm not sure how to begin this story, because it's not the kind of tale I ever imagined I'd be telling. It's messy, complicated, and it's wrapped in layers of guilt and desire that I still don't fully understand, but it's my truth. And there's a strange kind of relief in finally putting it into words. It started on a Tuesday. Isn't it always the most ordinary days that change everything? The morning began like any other. I woke up early, the room still bathed in that soft gray light of dawn. Greg, my husband, was already gone. He'd left for a business trip the night before, and the house felt quieter without him. Too quiet, I stretched, feeling the warmth of the sheets against my skin. And for a moment, I lingered in bed, savoring the stillness. I've always loved the early hours of the morning. There's something magical about them, as if the world hasn't fully woken up yet. It's the time when I feel most at peace, when I can gather my thoughts and prepare myself for the day ahead. That morning, I made my way to the kitchen. The towels cool beneath my bare feet. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and I smiled to myself, Ethan. My stepson was already up. Ethan, he's the kind of young man who makes you stop and take notice. At 22, he's got this quiet confidence about him, a maturity that's rare for his age. He's tall with broad shoulders and a lean frame, and his dark hair always seems to fall just perfectly across his forehead. But it's his eyes that really give me deep ocean blue and always so focused. There's a seriousness to him, a thoughtfulness that makes you feel like he's really listening when he looks at you. We've always gotten along well, Ethan and I, since he moved back in after college. We've settled into a comfortable rhythm. He's considerate, kind, and he has a way of making the house feel alive. In a way it didn't before. But that morning, there was something different about him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air, a quiet energy that made my skin prickle. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him as he stood by the window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a golden glow around him. And for a moment, I forgot to breathe. He was lost in thought, his brow furrowed slightly, and I found myself wondering what he was thinking about. I wanted to ask him to reach out and smooth the lines on his forehead. But I hesitated. There was something about that moment that felt too fragile to disturb. "Good morning," I said, finally breaking the silence. He turned to look at me, and when our eyes met, I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite name. His gaze lingered on mine for a moment, longer than usual, and then he smiled. A slow, easy smile that made my heart skip a beat. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft and low. We didn't say much after that. The morning passed in a blur of quiet companionship, him scrolling through job postings on his laptop, me flipping through a magazine. But there was an undercurrent to it all, a tension that I couldn't ignore. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, and I'd quickly look away, pretending not to notice. That evening, I decided to go for a swim. The weather had been unusually warm, and I thought the cool water might help clear my head. I changed into my swimsuit and stepped outside. The evening sun casting long shadows across the yard. The pool shimmered in the golden light, and for a moment I hesitated. I don't know why, but I felt nervous, as if I were about to step into something I wasn't ready for. I slipped into the water, the coolness enveloping me like a second skin. I swam laps back and forth, losing myself in the rhythm of it. It was only when I reached the edge of the pool that I noticed him, Ethan, standing there watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I couldn't move. He was leaning against the fence, his arms crossed over his chest, and there was something in his expression that made my breath catch high. He said quietly, his voice carrying across the stillness of the evening. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. There was a heat in his gaze, a raw intensity that made my stomach flutter. He stopped just a few feet from the edge of the pool, and for a moment we just stood there, the air between us crackling with tension. "You look beautiful," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I felt my cheeks flush, and I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out instead. I watched as he knelt down by the edge of the pool, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of wet hair from my face. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant. And when his fingers grazed my skin, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Lauren," he murmured. His voice barely audible, his eyes searched mine. And for a moment, I thought he might say something more, but instead he leaned in his lips, brushing against my cheek in a soft, lingering kiss. The warmth of his breath against my skin made my heart race. And when he pulled back, I felt a pain of something longing desire. "I wasn't sure I'll see you inside," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Then he stood and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I stayed in the pool for a long time after that, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt like a line had been crossed, one that we couldn't uncross. And deep down, I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same again. That night after Ethan kissed me by the pool, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quiet. The memory of his lips on my cheek played over and over in my head, the warmth of his breath lingering like a ghost. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of misplaced affection, a slip of the heart, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a crack in the foundation of the life I built, a fissure that threatened to grow if I wasn't careful. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. Greg was found asleep beside me, his soft snores a reminder of the life we built together. He was a good mankind, steady, reliable, but he wasn't the kind of man who noticed the little things, the quiet details that made me feel seen. Ethan noticed everything. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Greg, and patted down the hallway to the kitchen. Maybe a glass of water would help. Or maybe I just needed to move, to do something, to distract myself from the thoughts that were spiraling. Out of control, the kitchen was bathed in soft moonlight, the towels cool beneath my bare feet. I filled a glass at the sink and leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the backyard. The pool glimmered faintly, a reminder of the evening that had unraveled me. Can't sleep, I jumped, nearly dropping the glass. Ethan stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouette against the dim light from the hallway. He was wearing sweatpants and a loose t-shirt. His hair towels looked like he'd been lying awake too. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You," he shook his head. Stepping into the kitchen, "Mind if I join you?" I nodded. Though my heart was already pounding, he moved to the fridge, pulling out a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter beside me. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us stick with things neither of us dared to say. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable earlier." His voice was soft, tinged with regret, and it pulled at something deep inside me. I turned to look at him, the moonlight casting shadows across his face. His ocean blue eyes were intense, searching mine as though he could see straight through, to the thoughts I was trying so hard to hide. "You didn't," I said, though the words felt heavy, like they carried more weight than I was ready to admit. I wasn't expecting it. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know I shouldn't have done it. It's just," he hesitated, his voice trailing off, as though he were trying to summon the courage to say what came next. "You're different, Lauren. You make me feel things I don't even understand." My breath caught in my throat and I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was nothing but a fleeting moment, a mistake we could forget. But the way he looked at me, so raw, so vulnerable, made it impossible to lie. "Ethan," I started, but he stepped closer, cutting me off. "I know this is complicated," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend I don't feel it. I can't pretend I don't want you." His words hung in the air between us, charged with a tension that made my head spin. I could feel the heat of his body so close now. and the scent of him clean and faintly spicy filled my senses. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "We can't," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "But right now I don't care." And then he kissed me. It wasn't like the soft hasn't kissed by the pool. This was desperate hungry, like he'd been holding back something he could no longer contain. His hands cupped my face, his fingers tingling in my hair as he pulled me closer. I shouldn't have let it happen. I should have pushed him away, reminded him of the line we couldn't cross. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back. The glass slipped from my hand, shattering against the floor, but I barely noticed the sound was distant, meaningless against the roar of my own heartbeat. My hands have moved on their own, one finding its way to his shoulder, the other resting lightly against his chest, feeling the warmth of its skin beneath my trembling fingers. For one stolen moment, I let myself forget everything. Then, as if suddenly realizing the weight of what we had just done, I gasped and pulled away. I stepped back quickly, my breath coming in uneven burst, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. I could still feel his warmth, could still taste the moment lingering between us. My mind was a blur caught between two opposing forces, one screaming at me to run, the other aching to reach for him again. My forehead nearly touched his, and for a brief second I saw the way he was looking at me. His eyes searching mine, filled with something raw, something real, and then all at once, reality came crashing down. I stepped further away, breaking the connection, my hands flying to my lips, as though I could somehow erase what had just happened. The air between us once filled with something intoxicating and unspoken, now felt thick, suffocating with the weight of what we had done. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My chest ached with something I couldn't name, something between regret and longing. "What have I done?" Ethan remained frozen, his gaze locked on mine, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched heavy and unbearable, but I couldn't bring myself to fill it. I turned away from him, pressing my fingers to my forehead, trying desperately to think, to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions crashing over me. But there was no sense to be found in this. There was no excuse, no justification, only the stark, horrifying truth. I had betrayed my husband, Greg. His name alone sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing through me, so strong I almost felt sick. Greg, who had done nothing but love me, who had never once given me a reason to doubt him. Greg, whose only crime was being away too often, working too hard to provide for us. I closed my eyes tightly, but it didn't stop the flood of emotions. The memories of Ethan's lips against mine. How easily I had allowed myself to fall into something. I knew I shouldn't want Lauren. Ethan's voice was quiet, hesitant, as if afraid that one wrong word might shatter whatever fragile grip I had on myself. I shook my head quickly, finally finding my voice, though it trembled as I spoke. "No," I said, my tone firm, though the unsteadiness of my breath betrayed me. This can happen." The words felt like an anchor, something solid in a moment when everything else felt too fragile. Too uncertain, I turned back toward him, meeting his gaze, forcing myself to ignore the part of me that still wanted to close. The distance between us again. I don't know what came over me. I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe it was... I stopped, swallowing hard. No, that's not an excuse. Ethan's expression shifted as if he wanted to say something to protest, but I couldn't let him. I had to stop this before it could go any further. "Ethan, listen to me," I said, and his name felt too intimate, too heavy on my tongue. "This can't happen again, ever." He stayed silent, but I could see the battle in his eyes, the way his jaw tensed, as if he was fighting against words he wanted to say. "I mean it, I press," my voice breaking slightly. "I can't do this to Greg, I won't. He's a good man, he loves me. He trusts me, and I took a deep breath, trying to study the storm inside me. I can't betray him like this. I won't. Ethan looked at me then, and there was something in his expression that made my chest tighten. Pain, understanding. And something else, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I exhaled shakily. I won't let my emotions get the best of me again. I continued softer this time. Whatever this is, whatever we thought this was, it ends here. He looked like he wanted to argue, to reach for me, but he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his expression unreadable. This never happened, I whispered. And it can never happen again. A long silence stretched between us. Heavy and unbearable, my heart was still racing. My lips still tingling from the kiss. I wished I could forget, but the decision had been made. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice rough. When he finally spoke, okay? Relief washed over me, but it was a hollow victory. My chest still ached, my emotions still swirled chaotically. But at least the words had been spoken. The boundary had been drawn, and my husband, your dad, can never know. No one can. I won't say anything, he promised. Though his voice was hoarse, almost distant, I nodded. Turning away before I could second-guess myself, before the pull of whatever had just happened could tim me again, I walked away without another word, leaving Ethan standing there in the silence. But even as I moved, even as I tried to steady my breath and rebuild the walls I had let crumble, I knew the truth from that day forward. We never spoke about it. We didn't acknowledge it. Didn't revisit it, not with words, not with glances, not with anything at all. It became a ghost between us, an unspoken thing that lingered in the spaces where we used to be comfortable, turning easy moments into strange silences. The laughter we used to share became measured, careful. The way we moved around each other felt more like an choreographed dance, always ensuring we never stepped too close. The warmth I had once found in his presence became something I had to avoid, something I had to remind myself was dangerous. We were polite, we were distant. But no matter how hard we tried, no matter how much we convinced ourselves that it was over, the truth was simple. Some things once felt can never truly be undone.